What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here, and Path of Exile 3.18 is coming out very soon, or maybe it already has, and you're trying to figure out your league starter. And anyway, I'm doing the same video that I did for 3.17. Of course, there are no patch notes, so all we're really doing here is saying, hey, player behavior is updated, people have found better builds. Of course, there are some new uniques and whatnot. So, what did early league 3.17 data tell us about what might be good in 3.18? So let's talk about what this video is about. So I went to pee.ninja, great website by the way, and I wrote in pretty much every build that was at the top of the ladder and just started slicing down the data. Using, by the way, solo stuff on Arch Nemesis, which is good for most of us mortals who don't make a mirror in a week and a half. Of course, you can get lucky, get some lucky drops, whatever, but like, hey, we're not relying on aura bots, we're not doing a big, group magic fighting session. It's just like people who are playing the game a lot and doing pretty well. So basically, week one gave us a minimum character level of 79, which is pretty solidly into maps. So you've certainly, I would say for most of these players, you've transitioned into your actual league start build. If you're playing into maps and you're a week in and you haven't played your first build yet, you're not a league starter, right? So this is generally actual league starters. To be fair, this will catch people who transition in yellow maps or something like that. Of course, there's going to be some things going on there. But anyway, we're starting at minimum level 79. And basically, I'm just going to cut down the data by sort of 1/3, the bottom third of the players each time. So I cut down to 86 and above, and then 89 and above, then 91 and above, and then level by level by level, which tends to cut it by half once you're doing single levels at a time in like the 90s. Anyway, basically using that as a way to try to indicate, okay, well, if 5,000 people made maps on Explosive Arrow and 4,000 of those made it to 94, wow, that's really, really good. Basically, I'm using XP per level, or sorry, XP per day, basically, as a pretty good indication of power. It's not perfect, of course, but that's what we're trying to do, basically. And I'm normalizing all of the builds by comparing their sort of prevalence at 79 to the prevalence at 86 or 89, and using that as an indicator of like, well, of all players who made endgame, how far did they make it in the first week? And that's an okay methodology for actual power. So, of course, there are limitations here. We're not actually measuring power. We're measuring placement on a ladder at 1 week. There are limitations to that, right? So I'm entering the data in manually. As far as I know, there's no API to just like dump that into Google Sheets, so I could have made transcription errors. XP per hour is not the only metric that matters, of course. But this will tell you how fast you clear maps. This will tell you how safely you clear bosses, since you're SSF, you have to stay in your own maps. It's not dying. And so it's actually pretty well rounded. XP per hour is, I would say still, if you're going to use only a single metric, SSF XP per hour is maybe the single best metric you could use. You would want more if you could, but as far as individual metrics, it's not a bad one. There are biases around player selection. So if ultra hardcore players play Detonate Dead, and by ultra hardcore, I mean like people who put in 16 hours a day for a week, if only no-lifers play Detonate Dead, well, all the Detonate Dead's going to be 90 plus. And if people who don't ultra grind play things like Arc, they're all going to be like 70 to 80. And that's going to have biases, right? So keep that in mind. There are a lot of Elementalist Arc characters out there, by the way. There's also a bias because I'm using pee.ninja and saying, hey, show me which builds have, Explosive Arrow in a 5-link. Show me which skills have Bane in a 5-link. Show me which skills have Lightning Strike in a 5-link. This can do really weird things where if, for example, your minion build runs both Absolution and Zombies in a shared 5-link, that's going to do weird stuff where, like, only players who have found a 6-link have Zombies as a 5-link. If they're not using a staff, basically, right? So that's going to do weird things for how they're gonna show up, right? That's all going to be there. If you're using Wintertide brand and Vortex and whatever else is Cold Dot, well, do you have a 5-link for your Vortex or not? Do you have a 5-link for Wintertide brand or not? I don't know. Again, biases here, right? We are going to miscount in some cases. Same thing goes for Split Arrow and Puncture for Gladiators. Again, it's not perfect. Final thing is at the very top end of the ladder, there are under 197s. There are only 30 98s. There are 13 99s. There's only 6 level 100s. So we kind of definitionally can't have a representative sample of all of these builds. So again, there are biases here. Let's keep that all in mind. But I'm going to do my best to interpret the data in a good way and try to not overly sell things that probably shouldn't be sold, okay? We're not going for snake oil here. All right, so here's the unreadable graph. This is taking every single build that had 0.9% of the ladder at 79 and above and saying, you matter, we're going to track you throughout life. So everyone starts at 100%, right? Because 100% of all cyclones at 79 were cyclones at 79, right? But then you go to like 86 for the first cutoff, and it's like, oh, we cut off 1/3 of the players, but we cut off half the cyclones. Oh, well, crap. Relative performance here is of players who made it to like mid-white maps, which percentage of players actually made it to yellow maps, which percentage of players made it to red maps. And so you can see here that this thing diverges pretty quickly. There's some really big spikes, again, where we give really big spikes from like 96, 97, when I believe this is, I think it might be like Lightning Strike or something, or Lightning Arrow, where it's like, surprise, 6 of me made it to level 97. I'm 1/5 of the ladder at 97 plus. And it's like, well, okay, that's kind of BS. So, there are some weird things going on here. The 1 of at the very end, by the way, is the 1 out of 6 Lightning Arrow, because Lightning Arrow is like the 12th most popular skill, but was 1 out of 6. So it's heavily overrepresented at level 100. Again, not perfect. Let's move on and use something that's actually more useful. So this is actually what I think is the most useful graph in this entire thing. So this is, comparing your share of the ladder at 95, which still has over 100 samples, to your share of the ladder at level 79. So every build is still here. Right, there still are some builds out there, but you'll notice that there's only 6 builds whose share has grown. They are the ones taking up all the top spots in the ladder. They are the ones who are doing really, really well. Explosive Arrow was the most popular build by far, and it actually grew in share. So even though everyone's flocking Explosive Arrow, those who flocked in tended to outperform anyone else, well, most other players in the top 15 skills. They outperformed the mean player, in that at week 1, of everyone who got to 79 or higher, a disproportionate number of Explosive Arrow players got to 95 or higher. So they're doing really, really well. Spectral Helix continues to be a very good league starter, where even a full week into the build, Spectral Helix ends up being a solid performer, where they are represented by 50% more than they were before. I want to point out that Spectral Helix, if I recall correctly, was one of the 6 level 100s, so you can push Helix all the way to 100. Works very, very well there. Seismic Trap is doing hugely well. Now, it's worth pointing out that Seismic Trap has room for its own biases. So, for example, the fact that they're going to be running Exsanguinate and Seismic Trap using 2 different buttons, and it's like, well, what if Exsanguinate is their 5-link? And they're on a 4-link Seismic Trap because they didn't find a 5-link chest yet, but they got some Deerstalkers, and they decided that Exsanguinate is going to be there, and they'll swap things around for bossing, possibly. That's a possibility. It is a 2-button build. You don't always find 2 good, large link of items, so that's theoretically possible. You just can't find a chest piece with 5 links in it. I mean, that can happen for the other build as well, don't get me wrong, but at least for Explosive Arrow, you have a bow and a chest, whereas for Seismic, you're not doing that. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's just theoretically possible. Lightning Strike doing very, very well in attack-based build that is overrepresented. It was very good last league, still good this league. I played that one last league, definitely pretty good build. Detonate Dead doing hugely, hugely, hugely well. It is overrepresented by 250%. If you made it to maps on Detonate Dead, chances are you made it really far to maps with Detonate Dead. This does really, really well. Worth pointing out one thing to jump back to Spectral Helix, that even if you are doing it to sort of league start, again, more and more players are actually pushing it all the way to the top of the ladder. So even if people tend to get off of Spectral Helix, the fact that it's above 100% means a lot of players really stick with it. And then I know I've seen some build creators throw out Fire Trap, but Fire Trap is indeed, via data, indicated to be a very strong performer. You'll notice that, of the top 5 skills, 3 of those 5 are overrepresented, aka they are really, really strong skills. And by the way, this is organized in terms of how popular you were at 79 plus. So EA was the most seen skill at 79 plus. Poison Concoction was the second most seen skill at 79 plus. Spectral Helix was the third most popular skill at 79 plus. Absolution was at number 4. Had a really hard time making it to 95. And so even though it is a reasonably good skill, we'll talk more about that later, it did not sort of survive the push to late reds without dying or clearing fast to keep the XP per hour up. But way down to the far side is Fire Trap, that is clearly doing incredibly, incredibly well. Detonate Dead, of course, was not a very popular build, had not really caught on too much, I guess, or a lot of people just didn't want to play it, or only the really, really hardcore players were willing to play it. But Detonate Dead is clearly very awesome, and again, Fire Trap acted very, very well at giving you good XP per hour. Seismic Trap further overperformed there, but Fire Trap was seemingly a top 6 skill in 3.17, and there are no balance changes, so that seems likely. So this is a breakout of what I'm calling the top 8 skills. This is the 6 that overperformed: Explosive Arrow, Spectral Helix, Seismic Trap, Lightning Strike, Detonate Dead, and Fire Trap. But we're also including Poison Concoction and Absolution because they were 2 very popular skills and are worth diving into. So we can see here, Detonate Dead is the one that has spiked really high at 96, 97. That's what this thing is right here. This is Detonate Dead spiking, because again, at 9697, we have under 100 characters, and so there's like a cluster of Detonate Deads that made it to 9697, that then, calms back down to a somewhat more reasonable, like, double size. This graph is ending at 98, by the way. There were only, I think, 12 99s, and that felt way too wonky, because you would have things like Poison Concoction, or Lightning Strike, I think was one of the level 100s, that just like, well, I went from 5% of the ladder to 20% of the ladder. And it's like, we don't need a 500% at the top of the graph here. Worth noting that Absolution has fallen off a cliff entirely, that even though it has done pretty well, it actually holds up for a while. It did slowly fall and fall and fall, and it was, underrepresented by more than half towards the end of its lifespan, towards the, late reds, basically. 95 is definitely a stopping point for a lot of players, in terms of just like, well, you start dying once in a while, and, it doesn't really tend to easily push beyond that. Of course, it can happen, but anyway, just kind of, again, most of these builds tend to go up compared to themselves. If you want to check the Fire Trap line, it like remains relatively flat for a while, troughs for a bit in the 90s, and then happens to do really, really well at like 95, 96. This is just how lower sample data works. There's a reasonable conclusion that Fire Trap actually kind of tends to fall off, but there happen to be 2 players or 3 players who did really, really well at 96, 97, 98, and are dragging Fire Trap up. This is limitations kind of data. It's not a guarantee that Fire Trap is actually amazing, but depending how you slice the data, then tends to look pretty good. But clearly we can see that, yeah, even going up to like 98 or so, basically all these builds have looked really, really good. Only Absolution really seems to fail to push really, really far. Then we have the sort of bottom skills. These are the ones who didn't make the top 8 cut. You can see, right, there's a lot of down and to the right, right? There's a lot of, if you weren't one of those top 8 skills, you tended to be less and less and less of the ladder. And I think this ends up being pretty telling because, hey, cutting off at 95 is arbitrary. Cutting off at 98 is arbitrary. But like, well, here's 79 and 86 and 88 and 89 and 90 and 91 and 92 and 93 and 94 and 95. And it's like, oh, yeah, every single one of these skills is less and less and less and less represented. The asterisk here is Lightning Arrow, because Lightning Arrow was one of the 6 level 100s. And that's why I cut it off at 95 or 98 here, by the way, because it became like a 1000% graph at the end. It was like, that's gonna look real stupid. So I decided not to for that one. Anyway, just by the way, that's how that worked. Poison Concoction was one of the other level 100s that one also could do some graph skewing. So again, it's kind of what I cut it off here. But yeah, of note that theoretically, both Righteous Fire and Lightning Arrow ended up actually having a few users at the very end, very top of the ladder. But if you look kind of closely at something like Righteous Fire, it actually remains relatively flat for a very, very long time. I'm actually calling out Lightning Arrow, Righteous Fire, and Vortex as builds that have remained relatively flat for a while here. Or did quite well here. But you can see, Cyclone just kind of fell off the entire way. Zombies fell off the entire way. I mean, it kind of spiked up for a bit, then came back down. Again, the idea of maybe being in an Absolution link kind of does some weird stuff there. But yeah, a lot of these skills do tend to fall off, do tend to be leak starters that don't scale very well or seem to scale very well in terms of XP per hour. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. I know it's like a little bit like number spammy, but again, you can see the list of all these skills, and basically none of them, aside from the 3 listed up there, tend to really, really, really hold on in terms of pushing and pushing and pushing and playing better and better and better content. So we have some conclusions to pull down here. We had 6 level 100s that made 100 in SSF by 1 week, which is 2 Poison Concoctions, 2 Spectral Helixes, 1 Explosive Arrow, and 1 Lightning Arrow. So, even though Lightning Arrow tended to fall off, there was one person who juiced it and did really, really well. The Poison Concoction tended to fall off as well and did not eat as well as the trap builds or the 2 attack builds, 3 attack builds because, Explosive Arrow. It did have 2 level 100s. It did that really, really well. I will say personally that, in my opinion, the meta does look really diverse. And the idea of GGG not buffing and nerfing skills, I mean, we literally have, if we look back at common skills that also did really well, we have an attack-based totem build. We have an unarmed build. We have 2 more attack-based build in Spectral Helix and Lightning Strike. And we have a summoner in Absolution. We have 2 trappers in Seismic Trap and Fire Trap. We have a 2-button build in Detonate Dead. Like, this is very, very different, right? Like, we're doing a lot of different things here. So I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, like, this feels very diverse to me, where there are clearly several very, very good skills that do really, really, really well. And I think it's awesome, right? That, like, there actually are a lot of playstyles out there that are doing very well. So in my opinion, I think meta does look really good. And I think that's wonderful. Anyway, worth pointing out that, yeah, the top 6 appear to be in order. Detonate Dead, Seismic Trap, Spectral Helix, Lightning Strike, which, by the way, 2-button build, Trapper, attack build, another trap build, Explosive Arrows, a totem build. Like, again, pretty good variety for the top 6. But in rough order, that seems to be how good they are. Detonate Dead is probably the best league starter. Again, it's crushing in terms of, I know its boss damage is good. It's clearly solid, because of how it's doing in the XP per hour graph. Like, you don't get XP per hour without destroying a bunch of maps. And these builds that are very good and safe bossing builds, and Seismic Trap, clearly have amazing map clear, right? That those are the ones that seem to be winning a lot of cases in XP per hour. Worth pointing out that Poison Concoction, Righteous Fire, Summon Skeletons, probably Skelly Mages, but it's SSF, so it's not guaranteed Skelly Mages. Absolution and Bane do all hold on for a while. They make it to around 95 pretty comfortably. And for a lot of us, like, 95 is more than enough for a league start, right? 95 is more than enough for, like, yo, I ran through every red map. I fully cleared my Atlas. I probably fought a bunch of bosses. Because you can go to 95 SSF, like, you're doing some real ass content, you know, in the span of a week. So those are all, you know, clearly playable league starters that definitely hold up and do pretty well. So that's pretty much the entire video. I think that's the rundown. Hope it was useful. I know there's not a lot of surprises compared to last time, but you know, seeing Absolution here, but seeing that it doesn't quite hold up to things like Seismic Trap. Seismic Trap, of course, did get nerfed in 317. Clearly, it's doing fine. Detonate Dead, clearly very, very good. And yeah, Explosive Arrow was as good as people thought, right? So, you know, checking in on the builds that did come in, things that were changed around, and yeah, hope it was useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.